March 18th, Sunday. At dawn I tried to follow the posts by myself and for a long time was hopelessly lost, so I guess it comes with experience. At 8:30, Major Gell, the second in command, came along and fussed about our positions. Wanted a Lewis gun covering this point, a sniper on that, a fire trench here and a grenade party there. I worked hard to carry out these redispositions and was just in the middle of reorganization when a runner called me to answer the field telephone. It was he again, speaking from HQ. I was to leave what I was doing and take one platoon to reconnoitre the road to Peronne, ready for the advance. So I detailed the platoon to get ready and sat down to write a note to Anstey saying where I had gone. While I was writing, a runner came with a message from Anstey ordering me to take one NCO back to Fourrières on the canal bank and there find billets for the company, which he was going to collect and march back immediately. It was a bright, clear morning, and the country looked beautiful as I set off across the open fields with Corporal Sisserman. The place where we had spent the night was Bazencourt Farm, just to the left of Biache. It was a high position overlooking the canal, and the litter of cartridge cases on the posts proved that the enemy snipers had had ample opportunities of showing their prowess. The gently undulating fields were very little shelled, and the fresh grass was only spoiled here and there by a circular mud-rimmed hole. But each field was liberally besprinkled with graves, in which we took morbid interest. Not one of them had been dug to any depth, and in each case some portion of the corpse protruded from one a bleached and polished skull, from another a rotted puttee and boot, from another the ammunition pouches. In several cases they had only been covered with a few inches of wet earth, which now was caked and hard, giving the appearance of mummies, except where the burrowing rats had broken away the mud and displayed a patch of blue tunic. There were a few unburied bodies about, and I had much difficulty in getting Sisserman past them. He wanted to stop and examine each for wounds and souvenirs. As it was, I'm afraid we progressed very slowly, and it was 2 p.m. when we slid down the bank into the sunken road beside the canal, where the littered dugouts and gun emplacements betrayed the hasty advance of our gunners. Following the canal, we came to Fourrières, where we found Battalion HQ in a large, badly battered house. They could not give me any assistance in my task, so I started off on my own to find billets for the company. I had just found one wretched shelter in a field to hold 6 men, and a portion of a house which would take a dozen, when the company marched into the village. Anstey led them into a field where our cookers were preparing dinner, and here they sat on the grass and ate their meal, while Anstey and I fished some lunch out of our mess box. Before we could commence it, however, a runner came to tell us. First, we were to stop billeting, second, we were marching up the line again at once, and third, we were to report to HQ immediately. The only thing I did at HQ was to have a good lunch, but Anstey was told to return to B Company, as Billy Kentish had turned up to resume command of D. I was wondering what had happened to Watkins, who has been missing since we left the trenches, and I learnt that he had returned to the Worcesters. At 5 p.m. it commenced to rain. At 6 it was dusk, and we once more set foot on the canal road. I don't know what possessed Billy to bring his horse with him, but he optimistically started off, riding at the head of the wondering troops. After about a mile, the road became a mere muddy track, which we had to follow in single file. Kentish had to dismount, and at times, when we came to fallen trees, he fell over them and then spent 5 minutes lifting his horse over. Finally, the road was so bad and the darkness so intense that we were in danger of walking into the canal, so Kentish led us off the road through a gap in the hedge into the fields on our right. Here we wandered for half an hour until, hopelessly lost, still carrying his horse and raving like a lunatic, Billy slung the reins to one of the men and plunged off alone into the darkness, leaving us standing in the drizzling rain. 20 minutes later we heard his voice shouting to us to lead on, and we marched after his voice, which we followed to a decent road that brought us to a point on the canal where the Royal Engineers were constructing a bridge. We crossed a Heath Robinson arrangement of planks and string and formed up on the wet marshes beyond the river. What happened to the horse I do not know, but it was not with us, and I suspect Billy of having consigned it to a watery grave. A short march up the marshy track, a turn to the right along a decent road, and in 10 minutes we were in Halle. We halted here at a company HQ, and Billy and I went in to see Sullivan, who had captured the village. We found him very luxuriously accommodated in a room furnished with cosy armchairs, mahogany pier glass, bedstead, curtains and carpets which the Boche had left behind. On the walls of the rooms, the playful Hun had left many sketches and ironic messages. Two that we saw were Great British Advance, many villages taken and Hague takes Halle, 4,000 Germans captured official. Sullivan pressed us to stay, and we accepted a drink and a cigar from a box decorated with a picture of the Kaiser, and listened to his excited account of the advance. We finished our drinks and continued our march for about half a mile, when we again halted, this time before a darkened and lonely house, which we found to be our battalion HQ. I did not enter, having a feeling that I was small beer in their esteem, but Kentish went in for a chat, and I expect a drink. He was not very long, and again we set off. The road along which we marched was lined with trees, and through these, from time to time, we caught glimpses of a fierce glow in the distance. Then we came to a place where the Germans had blocked the road by felling a large number of trees, and as we made a detour across the fields, we came into full view of the fire that was raging in Peronne. During all this march, I was very nervous. I had heard so many stories of booby traps and delayed mines that I was terrified by the sight of any old oil drum or coil of wire, and at every crossroads expected to find myself sailing up into the black sky. Nothing of the sort happened, however, and after passing first a few scattered houses and then regular rows, at 11 p.m. we marched into the principal street of the town. We did not enter the square, but I got a glimpse of it as we passed the end, and I saw that at this far end all the houses were in flames. A few figures were silhouetted against the blaze, and the lurid light danced and flickered over the rough shell-torn cobbles, and over all the rain poured steadily down. We marched straight on down a short, narrow road and then halted. Once again the troops melted into the darkness, and I was alone with Kentish and the servants. Following them into a house close by, I found a large party assembled in the cellar. To one corner of the room, Martin brought our mess boxes, but I was too excited and nervous to eat anything, so after a couple of drinks I went down the 2 steps which Kentish told me led to our sleeping quarters. This was merely another cellar, which the Boche had partitioned off into cubicles, fitted with wire beds. There was a filthy smell of decaying vegetable matter which I could not locate. Our room was very tiny, with a bed on each side, and between them a stove from which an iron chimney passed out into the open air through the cellar ventilator. Kentish came in a few moments later, and we both lay down, covered with our macks, and composed ourselves to sleep. Soon I heard the servants tramping overhead to their several sleeping quarters. One by one the officers retired, and all was quiet save for the drip, drip, drip of the rain, and an occasional bluster of wind in the courtyard over our heads. Kentish was already breathing deeply and regularly in the other corner. Tired as I was, I could not sleep, but lay awake thinking of the events of the past few days. It seemed years since we had spent that nightmare day in the cellar in Biache, but it was less than a week, and it was only 10 days since Harcourt and I tossed for leave. Poor old Harcourt. It was such rotten luck to go through trench raids and attacks and then be blown up by a booby-trap mine. That was a terrible, unforeseen death, and— Good God! An icy hand clutched my heart. Here was a perfect billet, dry, well-furnished and comfortable. In the villages, tiny hovels had been blown up. Entrances to waterlogged dugouts had been smashed in. Why had this been left? Obviously it was a trap, and fools that we were, we had walked into it. The sound of Kentish's light snoring maddened me. I strained my ears, and above the dripping of the rain I fancied I could hear the tick-tock of a fuse. This grew louder and louder until I could stand it no longer, and by coughing loudly and banging the bed I woke Kentish. He sat up grumpily, rubbing his eyes. "What was that blasted row?" "Which one?" I said guiltily. "There's lots going on." He listened for a moment and then lay down again, growling. But I didn't intend to let him sleep. "Did you hear about the booby traps in the Boche lines?" You know Sullivan found several in Halle?" No answer. "How long do they usually delay before exploding?" Silence. I paused a bit and then asked timorously, I say, "Billy, can you hear a curious ticking?" He pulled the coat from off his head and said, "You bloody fool," and snuggled down again. I was hurt by that, for I felt that nobody cared if I was blown up, so I resolved myself to die like a martyr, and then when we met in the afterworld I could say to Kentish, "I told you so." The consideration of this possibility rather cheered me, and casting aside my fears, I fell asleep. March 19th. I do not know how long I slept, but it must have been a couple of hours. I dreamt that I was lying there asleep, all being horribly quiet except for the drip of water and the wind. Suddenly, through the rain and darkness, appeared a huge figure stealing across the courtyard to the grating above me. He was muffled up in a great grey coat and spiked helmet. I struggled to wake Kentish and to shout, but I was powerless. I saw him take a bomb from under his coat, a smoking bomb, and slip it into the chimney. With a frantic struggle, I overcame my paralysis and sat up shouting as a metallic sliding sound came from the chimney. Waiting for the explosion, I sat staring into the darkness with that apathy that comes when fear has passed its bounds. But nothing more happened. Kentish slumbered on, and feeling I could not stay another minute, I slipped on my mac and went out into the rain. The morning must have been sending its first rays of light into the misty darkness, for I could dimly discern my surroundings, which were ruined houses and piles of wreckage. There was no road left, for the houses on either side had for the most part been blown up, and now the place was one long pile of bricks, earth, broken furniture, old clothes and twisted ironwork. Across this miniature mountain range had been worn a tortuous track, which I now followed until I was back on the road running into the square. The rain was now very much heavier, but it was growing rapidly light, and soon I was able to take a more detailed view of the town. The crossroads at which I stood was fairly clear, only a few shells having torn up the cobbles, leaving small jagged holes at intervals. On my left, the front of a house had fallen, leaving the undisturbed interiors of the rooms exposed like a large doll's house. Opposite me was a barn, through the open doors of which I could see one of our cookers glowing. Outside were a perambulator and two huge, wicked-looking Minenwerfer shells. Walking down to the square where the houses were still burning, as I passed the town hall, I saw the huge facade of two houses sway forward in the wind. I drew back and, standing under the colonnade of the town hall, watched the huge slice of masonry lean forward, pause, and then crash in a cloud of brick dust into the square. The interior of the house I saw, as I passed on, had been previously demolished. I now found myself in the square, the general aspect of which was one of cruel and dreary devastation. All the houses on my left were in ruins, whilst those on my right, though still standing, were badly battered, all doors and windows being smashed in. Opposite me, the whole side was enveloped in tremendous walls of fire. Near the centre of the square, an iron paling surrounded a stone pedestal from which the statue had been removed. I walked over to it, wondering what statue had been there, and then I stopped sickened by the sight of a body impaled on the iron spikes. In a Frenchman's blue uniform, gaily bedecked with ribbons, he hung with arms extended along the railing, his head hanging down onto his bright buttoned chest and his legs dangling. Sick with horror but impelled by curiosity, I went nearer and saw some straw sticking out at the knee. Then I peered into the face a black grinning mask and saw that it was a realistic dummy. Nevertheless, in the eerie half-light with the flicker of flames on that scene of devastation, it was a gruesome spectacle, and walking on I stood for a while at heat range from the flames into which the heavy rain poured with no effect whatever. Then I returned to the vast pile of ruins beside the pedestal and started to explore. Reapproaching the town hall, I saw, fastened to its side wall, an enormous blue notice board, Nicht arger, nur wundern. Do not be angry, only be surprised. This in letters a foot deep. People were now stirring in the billets, and as I passed the corner I saw the cooks Blackie Neal and Breakspear in the barn, cleaning dixies for the company's breakfast. I stopped and had a real Sergeant Major's cup of tea with them, before climbing back over the brick pile to our cellar. I noticed that opposite us was an enormous rectangular building in a large courtyard. The gates were shut and locked, so apparently no one had entered. At the end of the street, 100 yards away, I could see the marshes of the Somme Canal. We had a rotten breakfast, for our servants had let the HQ staff collar all the fuel and cooking places and most of the crockery, after which we sat and smoked until lunchtime, when received a warning order that we would move again that night. In the afternoon, I went up to the square again with Thatcher. On the way, he told me that when he entered the town, the dummy Frenchman was standing erect upon the pedestal in an heroic attitude. He had lined up his platoon and fixed a volley at it, bringing it tumbling down into the position in which I had found it. At 5 p.m. we paraded and marched out of the town, dead away from the square, through the ancient arch of the Faubourg de Bretagne, where high grass-covered slopes marked the old fortifications of the town. With the last house, the cobbled road ended, and we came to the junction of two poorly made roads. We took the right-hand one, filing round a long, dead horse that lay sprawled across the way. Just as it became dusk, we reached the edge of a deep quarry, the whole of which was overgrown with bushes and sodden with rain. The ground was slippery with mud, but we descended by a beautifully constructed winding stairway, which brought us to the mud track at the bottom of the shrubberies. There was practically no cover, so the troops commenced to make themselves bivouacs out of their oil sheets, whilst Kentish and I established our HQ in a tiny tarpaulin hut. This was quite bare and empty. The rain dripped through in many places, and altogether it was most uninviting. So I dumped my pack and went out again into the murky downpour. Quite close to us, the Boche had constructed a kind of pagoda of rootic wood. It appeared to be full of rubbish, and on it was chalked reserved for BAT, HQ. There had obviously been a German battery here, and during their spare time the gunners had beautified the place exceedingly. In all directions ran flights of steps with rustic handrails, rustic tables and seats were scattered about, and a huge rustic cross rose above a little row of graves at one end. Most of the shelters, however, were burnt, so we had very little practical benefit from their labours. Returning to the hut, I found it looking quite homely after the rain and mud in which the unfortunate troops had to spend the night. Our valises were laid out and a couple of candles were burning. The troops had filled up the larger holes with paper and laid out supper, on which Billy had already made a fair start. Removing my boots, I crawled into my valise. I was very wet, but as my valise also was soaked through, it didn't matter. Then I made a hearty meal of bread, bully and jam, and lit a pipe while we supped hot rum. Billy told me that we were in reserve to the front line and were in a quarry near Bouillé Wood. We were well within gun range, but clear of the enemy infantry. The mention of gun range made me nervous again, and I began to show it by asking questions. I was keen to know what cover we should take in case of shelling. He answered abruptly, "There isn't any cover," and blew his candle out. I followed suit and pulled the clothes over my head to shut out noises, but in a few minutes I heard a thud in the distance. "Was that ours or theirs?" I asked. "Ours now." And there was an impatient turn and snuggle. Another thud. How far away was that? Number answer. It made me worse to think that he was going to sleep to leave me to face the danger alone. So I asked him, "I say, if a shell got us, would it hit the top of the quarry first or drop straight in?" At that he sat up in bed. "You are a windy young bee, Vaughan. You've got to chance it wherever you are, so for God's sake shut up and go to sleep." I did shut up, but though thoroughly ashamed, I was still windy, and long after the distant shelling had stopped, I lay awake waiting for more thuds. At last, however, the lack of sleep on the previous night did its work, and I slept peacefully until the sun was well up and breakfast was cooked. March 20th. Major Gell came along during the morning and commandeered my platoon, and me, to clean out the pagoda ready for occupation by HQ. I say he collared us to do it, but actually we hardly did a thing, for he is a most energetic man, and clad in motorcycling leggings and coat, he dashed here and there carrying stoves and rubbish, seizing brooms to show the lads how sweeping should be done, and by tea-time had the place clean enough for the meal to be served therein. At sunset I went for a walk round the top of the quarry. There was, however, nothing to be seen but undulating slopes of grass, and as I had not the faintest idea where the enemy line was, I could not work up an interest. I turned in early, and was a little less windy, although the Boche shells fell much closer. March 21st. Without any warning, we were suddenly paraded at 10 a.m. and marched all the way back to Éclusier, via Péronne, Halle, Fouillères, and Frisé. It was a long march, and we were thoroughly tired when we arrived back at our original camp on the canal bank. The rain had stopped, and it was like coming home to get back into the old cubicles. We celebrated by sitting round a huge fire, the two of us, and drinking rum punch. I was beautifully sleepy and happy when I went to bed. Nevertheless, I lay awake for a long time, looking at the huge brazier throwing a vivid light over the room, and a flood of memories came upon me. I thought of the people at home, and what they were all doing then, of the 3 or 8th Battalion, of Watkins and Thomas, and our first tour up at Biaches, what years ago that seemed. And with Jerry retiring, it was obvious the war was ended. I wondered if I should meet Watkins again, or Thomas. March 22nd. We were all sent along to the quartermaster stores to draw a new kind of gas helmet, a rubber facepiece with a tube leading to a canister of chemicals, the whole installed in a square satchel to be carried on the chest. The troops are quite annoyed at having another bleed-in present for the Christmas tree. We of HQ have also been dished out with new tin hats fitted with a rail and hanging chain mesh to protect the eyes. We spent the afternoon putting on the gas masks to make animal noises at each other and saluting to make the helmets clank. Attended a lecture during the afternoon in Cappy. It consisted of instructions concerning the new gas helmets by the divisional gas officer. Thatcher, Bridge and Sullivan also attended, and on our way back we called at every mess to have a drink and look out acquaintances. Also bought large quantities of tinned fruit. On the road met Private Davies of the Worcesters, who had been Watkins's servant. He told us that Watkins had left that battalion and joined another division, March 23rd. The battalion marched back to Péronne today, but I was left behind with 13 and 14 platoons to guard stores until the transport collected them. I wandered round the billets, picking up oddments, French and German bullets and handbooks, until 3 p.m. when 2 general service wagons turned up. They could only take half the stores, so that we had to remain for the night. March 24th. I spent the morning with the 2 platoon sergeants, Hughes and Alsop, making out platoon rolls. During the afternoon, the wagons rolled up and were reloaded and dispatched. Shortly afterwards, a small party of NCOs reported to me. They were Sergeant Major Chalk of my company, who had first met me in Hallencourt, now returning from leave Sergeant Wheeldon, Sergeant Corbett and Sergeant Foster. I told them that we were rejoining the battalion on the morrow, and they should wait and march up with us. From Dunham I learnt that charge sheets would probably follow them, as they were ordered to remain at base for duty. Being anxious to get back, however, they had broken camp and stowed away on a ration train. They all seemed to be excellent fellows, and with the exception of Corbett, were coming to D Company. He, it appears, was a splendid NCO until he was badly wounded on the Somme in 1916, after which he went quite silly. Whenever he gets into the line, he goes mad, though he never shows any fear. At one time he secured a dugout, and if any stranger or undesirable visitor entered it, he hammered the fuse of a Dud-9 shell with an entrenching tool until he was again alone. He had been wounded a second time in a raid and was now returning from hospital. March 25th, Sunday. Set off at 11 a.m. and plodded up the muddy roads through Halle to Péronne, which we found very much cleaner, working parties having been busy on the roads. At Dead Horse Crossroads we took the left road, merely a muddy track, and at 4 p.m. reached the outskirts of Driancourt. Here I saw a signboard indicating Battalion HQ, which I found in a trench. They told me that Hatwell had returned from leave and was now taking over the company, now in the village of Templeux-la-Fosse, to which they gave me a guide. As we entered the village, the guide cheered me up by telling me that Jerry had been shelling the village all day. The street down which we started to march sloped from the top of a hill, and in front, where the houses stopped, we could see that it rose again to the top of a green ridge at our own level. We marched for about 50 yards, and then a sentry on the company HQ shouted to us to move along the houses in single file. We did this, but saw no reason for it, as we heard no shelling before we pulled up outside our HQ. I went into a courtyard to find Hatwell, passing 2 men with dixies going to draw water from the well. He was sitting just inside a doorway drinking whiskey with Kentish. I poured myself a drink and reported myself. 2 minutes later, there were 2 sharp crashes nearby. Then Anstey blew in with some more of his company, and we all went into the courtyard to study the map. We had been there scarcely a minute when a distant bang sent us flying to the door. I was last in and was sprinkled with mud as a shell burst a few feet from where we had been standing. I said to Anstey in great apprehension, "Would this wall stop one, do you think?" He replied dryly, "It probably will." And then the party broke up. I went out again with Hatwell, and he pointed out on the distant ridge the gun that was doing the damage. It was a field gun worked by 4 men with an officer watching us through glasses and directing the fire. Then we went in and finished our drinks, and he said, "Come along. I'll show you where to go and you can push off with your platoons." He went out on the road, and I, having stopped to put on Raypack, followed him. As I emerged, there was a crash, and I ran round the corner to see him lying on his back in the smoke of a shell. Corporal Newey was standing outside, and as he moved forward he said, "Hattie's a goner." Whereupon Hatwell sat up and said, "You're a bloody liar. Come and lift me up." We carried him into the house, where we found 2 perfectly round and bloodless holes in his thigh. He had had a wonderful escape, for the shell had burst almost at his feet. He wasn't a scrap disturbed by his wounds, but they made me feel faint, and I had to go out for some air. In the courtyard I found Major Gell looking for me. He instructed me to take 2 NCOs at once over to the Busu Road and find accommodation for the company. I obeyed him with alacrity, and as I collected the NCOs, I heard that the 2 men who had gone for water had been killed at the well, and a 3rd man blown down into it. It was dusk when we passed through the back of the courtyard, vaulting over the low stone wall, and hastened by the fall of another salvo of shells. Crossing the sodden fields, we very soon struck the point shown me on the map, and struck round in the darkness for shelters. In a very few minutes we found 3 large dugouts, each with 2 entrances, so I sent off a message to Gell and posted the other NCO on the road to guide the troops in. I then settled down in the centre dugout, which the Boche had evidently used as an HQ. It was divided into 2 parts, one of which I allotted to the sergeants, the other with 5 wire beds. I made our combined mess and servants' quarters. Here Kentish joined me at 9:30 p.m, and we proceeded to make ourselves comfy. Sitting on German grenade boxes, whiskies before us, a glowing brazier at the side, and with 2 or 3 sandbags wrapped round each foot, we were at peace with the world, and we discussed our probable future and the events of the past few weeks until 11 o'clock, when we climbed into our wire beds. I lay for a while on my upper berth, smoking and reading a book on trench warfare. Then I began to feel itchy, and the itchiness grew and spread so much that I was unable to concentrate on my book. So I lay on my back looking at the timber roof a foot above me, and I wondered whether the saw marks across the beams were the work of the Boche to ensure the roof falling in when a time mine exploded. I was distracted from this thought, with its potential horrors, by the sight of moving insects. Raising the candle, I found that the place was crawling with lice. During the night I felt them dropping onto my face, and in the morning I was infested with them. March 26th. As soon as I woke, I went out into the open, where I was met by a delightfully fresh breeze. The sun had risen, and the fields, trees and bushes looked beautifully sweet and green. There were no shell holes, and the new grass of the fields was besprinkled with gem like wild flowers. A few 100 yards away across the road was Boyer Wood. I filled my lungs with sweet air, and my eyes with restful green, and then walked along to the next dugout to visit the gas sentry. I was unable to find him, and my shouts down the staircase brought out Corporal Oldham, who told me that Private Dredge was on duty. We found him halfway down the steps of the next entrance fast asleep, woke him with a few well-chosen words, and left him under arrest. Then I went along and chatted with the other sentries, and such NCOs as I found seated by the roadside taking stock of their surroundings. Over breakfast I told Kentish that I had put Dredge under arrest for sleeping on sentry. He didn't quite know what to do, for if he had charged him officially, it would have to be tried by court-martial, and the penalty would be death. So he decided to have him in and frighten him, then let him go. While he was doing this, A terrific howling arose from a dugout which we had forbidden the troops to enter on account of falling walls. On investigation, we found Swindon, a village idiot type of soldier, half buried by a fall of earth. He had gone in to look for souvenirs, and when we had dug him out, Kentish delivered a second lecture, this time taking as his text, "Be sure your sin will find you out." At 5:30 p.m. we fell in on the road in marching order. At the same moment, as usual, it began to rain heavily, and it became dark quickly as we marched towards Templeux. After about a mile, when the roads were nice and slushy and we were wet through, we left the road and followed a faint track to the right, which took us to Tincourt Wood. It was now pitch dark, and we entered the wood in single file, keeping touch by holding the equipment of the man in front. I was last man, and after a short while, the party having halted, and a confused murmur of voices rising in front, I went forward and found that Dunham had fallen over a tree stump, let go the man in front, and so lost touch. I gave instructions that no one was to move, and then set off as fast as I could to find the leading half company. I successfully lost myself, and for about 20 minutes wandered about the black, dripping wood shouting at the top of my voice. Then I saw a faint light flashing in the distance, and following it came upon Kentish and Sergeant Major Chalk, who, having led the rest of the company in, had come back to find me. Close at hand was a tiny tarpaulin hut, which was now our HQ, and when we were seated therein with drinks, Billy told me that the company was holding a line of posts in front of the wood, which we would have to visit by turns. Half an hour later he went out for the first tour, and I lay down on the floor and slept until midnight, when Sergeant Hughes came in and wakened me. March 27th. We went out into the rain, which was now very much heavier, and followed a tape to the end of the wood. Emerging onto the open hillside, we skirted the trees until they ran straight forward to a point. Here we found a post and got down into the bit of trench. As, however, we were only a reserve line, there was nothing to be seen or heard except rain. It was so dark that we could not see each other's faces. Corporal Johnson gave us a guide who led us to the next post on the right, and so we continued along the line. At 10 a.m. I was detailed to take the company across to the Aiscourt-Nurlu road, and there fill up an enormous mine crater. It was very unsatisfactory work, for though 90 men were hard at it for 4 hours, throwing in hundreds of barrows of stones and earth, there was not the slightest sign of the crater being smaller. In their retreat, the Germans have been very thorough, and mines have been exploded at every crossroads, and at such strategical points as this, on hillsides and in cuttings, so that transport is quite impossible. The engineers are finding it quicker to make new roads than to fill up the craters. In addition to this, trees have been felled across the roads in hundreds of places, and most of the wells have been blown in or poisoned. In some cases, dead horses and mules have been thrown in. When we returned to the wood, I found Colonel Harrison there. He instructed me that as soon as it was dusk, I was to take one platoon and patrol the road up to Villers-Faucon. Meanwhile, we were to march on and take up new quarters in a small village called Longuevesnes, which company had taken the day before. So without resting, we followed him through the wood and up this village. There was practically no accommodation here, and the troops had to set to work at once to make themselves bivvies by fastening oil sheets together and fixing them to the tops of low walls. We made our headquarters in a chicken run, in which we could just stand upright. Here I dumped my kit and then went forward to look at the roads which I was to patrol at dusk. There were 2 parallel roads running up to Villers-Faucon, and I was to have a half platoon on each. The weather had suddenly changed, and now a light snow was falling. As soon as I got back, I started to muster the platoon. But what with the issuing of rations and their being scattered all over the ruins, it was 9:30 p.m. before we moved off. The snow was much heavier now, and was lying thickly upon the ground. We walked slowly along the top of the bank, to avoid the mud of the road, and without any excitement came upon the first houses looming up in the darkness. Then in a few minutes we reached the crossroads, where we were joined by the other half platoon. I asked Corporal Wood, who had led them, whether he had anything to report, and he said, "Well, sir, there's a feller up t'other corner, as seems half-cocked." I asked him a few questions, and he answered like a village idiot. So I went along with Wood and found a trooper standing in the middle of the road, I too questioned him as to who he was and where his regiment was disposed, but he made perfectly futile replies and grinned idiotically. So presuming that he was shell-shocked, I collected my troops and went on up the road to the right, where, turning a bend in the road, we struck a weird scene. First, there was a Bengal lancer chattering with cold, holding the bridles of about 20 horses. A little further on, right in the middle of the road, was an enormous brazier, with flames leaping about 6 feet into the air. Around it were squatting a circle of native lancers, perfectly motionless. There was a strange appearance of a theatrical scene, with the lurid light shining on their turbans and beards, and on the snow-covered ruins behind them. I advanced to the group and asked if there was an officer about. Immediately an excited chattering broke out among them until I repeated my question. Then one enormous fellow got up, and coming to me with an extraordinary dancing gait, sang in a nasal monotone officier. "Oui, officier, oui!" Beckoning to me to follow him, he led me across some ruined gardens and broken walls, to where a house was fiercely burning. Then turning, with an expressionless face, he said, "Officier là," and gracefully avoiding me, he retraced his steps and rejoined the silent circle. I was now firmly convinced that the village was full of lunatics, so without inquiring any more, I went on up the road until I came to another broad crossroads, in the centre of which was the entrance to a tunnel. Inside I found a room wherein was a major commanding the 8th Hussars. I told him that I wanted to know who was holding the village, and what the dispositions were. He proceeded to mark on my map the exact positions of the posts around the village. Boasting of their courage and skill in capturing the village, he asked me to see that they were relieved at once as they were tired out. He was also very windy, and at every mention of shelling or a counterattack, his voice rose to a scream. When I told him about the village idiot we had met, he said, "Ah, that's a smart fellow. I've given instructions that no information must be given to anybody." When I left him, I was laughing heartily within myself. Firstly, because the village was empty when he took it, and not a shot was fired, and secondly, because, although he had warned his troops not to give any information away, I, a stranger, had walked in and asked the most important questions, and was leaving with a marked map. And he hadn't even inquired what battalion I was or where I came from. We returned to Longavanay, repassing the Bengalese, still squatting in the snow, and a number of limbers being unloaded. At 1:30 a.m. I got back to my chicken run, made out a report, and climbed into my wire bed. March 28th. There was nothing doing during the day, so I had a good lounge about the village, being keenly interested in deducing the life and dispositions of the Boche from the ruined houses and signboards. The gardens had been well kept and were full of flowers and vegetables which now were overlaid with bricks and dust from the shattered houses. There are hundreds of fruit trees, but every one has been sawn through and felled. At the crossroads was a well, but this had been blown in, so that our only supply was from our water cart, a water bottle full per day for all purposes if we were lucky. Of course we did not shave and washed only if we could find a clean puddle, which was seldom. Just behind our billet was a large German cemetery, beautifully laid out. There were 575 graves, and nearly all had stone monuments or crosses. In the centre was a huge German cross of blackwood, but this had been struck by a shell and was splintered. At the far end was a calvary, a little mound arched in the trees with a life-size crucifix in the centre. In the evening a fire broke out outside our billet. A haystack buried by a fallen house had been smouldering for 2 days, and now commenced to burn furiously. I was terrified that it would draw shelling and spent a couple of hours throwing earth on it all to no purpose. So I left it. It was ignored by Jerry and burnt out during the night. March 29th. At dawn, we were unceremoniously routed out and marched a few hundred yards up the Villa Faucon road to the shelter of a steep ridge. The line in front was advancing, and we were to support them if required. The cookers followed us up and gave us a good breakfast, which we heartily enjoyed in the open air. However, we heard no sound of the fighting and marched back to billets at 11 a.m. Later I met the Roman Catholic chaplain of the brigade living with the 7th Battalion. I did not care for him. He was a convert parson, had red hair and no sense of humour. March 30th. I was detailed to go up at 10 a.m. with Kentish and the commanding officer to study the line. We proceeded to a spot in front of Grow Wood, where they spread themselves over a map. They ignored my presence, but by listening to their talk and sneaking glances at the map, I gathered that they were merely identifying landmarks. We were interrupted by a terrific crash as a coal box burst overhead and the bullets ripped up the turf around us. 2 or 3 more came, and it was obvious that we were being potted. So we ran back to the shelter of the woods, followed by 6 more shrapnel shells. We were detailed to go up wiring in the evening, and at 9 p.m. Thatcher turned up to act as guide. He led us up to Villers-Faucon, and while we were marching through the town, we heard an aeroplane approaching. It was a brilliant moonlight night, and we stood like statues in the shadow of the houses as he swooped down onto the street. He did not spot us, and after circling round once or twice, he went back again, and we continued through the village. We moved out onto the open fields in front and marched on and on in the snow, as I thought, moving in a circle. Actually, Thatcher had entirely lost his bearings and had to leave us to find the spot we were to wire. After a time he returned and said we were on it, so I spread out the company and allotted them their various jobs. It was frightfully cold, but clear, and the bright moonlight helped us a lot. Thatcher and I supervised the work from either end, and very soon a double row of stakes was in position. Then, as they started to run up the strands of wire, I went along to Thatcher, who was delighted to see me produce a flask from my pocket. A tot of rum cheered us up a lot, and I returned to my end of the line. Here, on the top of a little hill, I helped with the wiring for a bit, and then went across to where Corporal Breeze was sitting on a pile of stakes beating his hands. It was a very quiet and lonely scene. The slope of snow down from behind us, nothing visible but the whiteness of the earth merging into the grey of the sky, the line of little men at their noiseless tasks and the cold moonlight over all. As I sat drinking in this scene, Breeze touched me on the arm. "There's someone declared peace," he said, and pointed across past the last stake. Covered with snow, as with a sheet, lay the body of a Boche, looking calm, and I somehow felt happy. Yet the sight of him made me feel icily lonely. It seemed such a terrible thing to lie alone, covered with snow throughout the night, with never a sound until we came along, and tapped and clipped and never spoke, and then went away forever. It seemed so unfriendly, and for a long time I sat wishing we could do something for him. At length I passed down along the line again to Thatcher, who decided it was time to withdraw. So we passed along the word to cease work, and the troops fell in. As they lined up, I could not help thinking of my poor Boche up on the hill, and I imagined a piteous look on his face as he heard us marching away, leaving him once more to silence and solitude. In the front rank was a man called Bailey, and as I looked along them to check their wire cutters and gloves, I noticed he was carrying a pair of boots. I asked him where he got them. He said brightly, "Jerry up on the hill, sir." My poor Jerry. We marched back and left him. March 31st. I was not expecting any work today, but at lunchtime I received very vague instructions from Kentish. Number 13 platoon had been sent up to a sunken road on the left of Villers-Faucon to occupy some posts. I was to move up at once with number 14 platoon, wait on the road until a new battalion name unknown came up and relieved us, then march back the 2 platoons. We were to move in marching order and carry Lewis guns. I at once fell in the platoon, then found that Kentish had forgotten to have the Lewis guns brought up from the rear. So he said, "All right, you go off without the gun teams, and I'll send them on later." I asked him to lend me a map, but he would not, so I fixed the position in my head and made a rough sketch of the positions he had marked in the sunken road. When I marched off, my platoon minus Lewis gunners numbered Sergeant Alsop and 6 men. I struck across to the left and followed the valley until I hit the road 3/4 of a mile to the left of Villers-Faucon. Then I turned in towards the village. Arriving at the point where I considered number 13 platoon should be, I took Sergeant Alsop and Corporal Oldham across the field in front to find their posts. I was quite elated to see, almost at once, a fellow walking along the top of a trench. Below him, 2 heads were showing above the parapet. I called my NCO's attention to them, and we made in that direction. We saw one of the men get out of the trench and run across to another post where he fixed up a machine gun. Suddenly, Sergeant Alsop clutched my arm, crying, "I don't like the look of them, sir. I believe they're Boche." I whipped out my glasses, and sure enough, they were Germans fixing up a machine gun. We gave them no chance to use it, for we cut back to the road as hard as we could go. A little further along the road, we saw some fellows erecting a tin shelter in a field. Approaching, we found they were troopers of the 8th Hussars, and they told us that the spot where we had seen the Boche was the line occupied by our 13 platoon, so we decided to return and have another look. We had only gone about 30 yards when there was an excited shout from the Hussars, and one ran over with a message slip. From OC 8th Hussars. Warwick's posts on left have been forced back and are occupied by the enemy. Take special precautions and get into touch with their new positions. This put me in a frightful fix, as the relieving troops were due in an hour's time. I felt that my duties were first to let HQ know what had happened, second to find where the platoon now was, and if necessary take them to recapture their posts, and third to ensure that the incoming troops were met and warned of the retirement. I considered it best, therefore, to send 2 men back to HQ and a couple to right and left to try to get into touch with 14 platoon, whilst I remained on the road to receive reports. The patrol from the left found nothing, but the one from the right reported that higher up was a road which corresponded to the one where my party should have been, but it was quite empty. I went with them to satisfy myself that this was correct, and on my return met the relieving troops. I explained matters to the company commander, and after a powwow, we decided that he should carry out his relief, commencing from the right and working along the line. If his left platoon could not find the posts, then we would take steps to search the country for the missing troops. I remained with him on the road to pick up my party. I had to reply to my message to HQ. I waited on for several hours in the darkness until the relief complete messages rolled in. 1, 2, 3, and finally 4 reports were received, and knowing that my platoon was found, I breathed a sigh of relief and waited for them to come along. For an hour and a half I sat there, and still they did not come, so I presumed that they had gone back by the other road in Villers-Faucon. Then I marched off back myself with my 4 remaining men. I called in at an old sunken balloon shed where our battalion HQ had been, but found that they too had been relieved and gone back. So in the pouring rain I continued my march to Longovesna. April 1st, Sunday. At 12:30 a.m. on the outskirts of the village I met Billy Kentish, wet through and half mad with rage. "Thank God! Where the hell have you been? The commanding officer's been waiting and I've been lurking round in the rain for hours." I asked him if the other platoon had reported okay, and he simply screamed a string of oaths. "What? You haven't brought them? You!" As he was offering his congratulations, Colonel Hansen came up. He waited to hear no explanation, but as soon as he heard that the platoon was not there, he became white with anger. He said nothing except stay here until you find them. Then he returned to Driancourt with his HQ staff. Kentish had with him Corporal Kent, the post-corporal, and Sergeant Major Chalk, and now we went up the muddy roads and across sodden fields yelling 13 platoon, Corporal Wood, and Kent calling in a doleful voice, "Bobby E, Bobby E," until at about 2 a.m. we heard an answering hail, and 13 platoon came trudging down the road which I had used. They told us that they had not been relieved at all by the incoming troops. The position which they had occupied was not the one which was marked on Kentish's map, but was on another road further forward. The report that the Boche had taken their posts was false, though a Ulan patrol had actually ridden up and down a wood in which Corporal Newey and his post had been hidden. The relieving platoon had taken up its position in the road behind, and it was not until Corporal Wood took a walk back that he found that he should have been relieved. All this we learnt as we trudged back through the rain to Driancourt, where at 5 a.m. we entered dugouts on the road in front of the village. It did not take us long to get fixed up, and in half an hour we were lying in our soaked clothing, trying to drive from our minds the dire foreboding of the tick-off which awaited us on the morrow. The tick-off came soon after lunch. The commanding officer came round, and on the road outside our HQ commenced to grind me to powder in front of Kentish. He told me it was a disgraceful thing that with 2 platoons at my disposal, I had made no attempt to recapture the posts. In my own defence, I had to point out that I had only 6 men, and that my first job was to find the other platoon. Of course, the absence of the Lewis gunners was brought out, and the commanding officer turned his batteries on Kentish. Finally, he switched back on me, saying, "Whatever the circumstances, I consider that it has been a disgraceful show, and not what is expected from an officer of this battalion." When he had gone, Kentish, smarting under his own reprimand, turned on me too, saying that it was a rotten thing to let my company commander down, and I should have kept quiet about the Lewis gunners. For the rest of the day I moped about, thinking that now my chances of shining were finished, and longing for a return to the line where a bullet might mercifully end the disgrace into which I was plunged. April 2nd. Moved up to Longovesna, this time to a different billet. A town major had taken charge of the village, and allotted a certain portion to each company. In our section there was very little shelter, and after squeezing the troops in amongst the ruins, we could only find a tiny harness room, about 9 feet by 6 feet, in which to make our HQ. There was no roof, and we were just stretching a tarpaulin sheet across, when there stalked up a great lanky lieutenant of the 4th Gloucesters, who said he was the town major, and this was his billet. So we had to clear out, and pending a further discovery, Dunham and I installed ourselves in an old boarded-up lavatory, and Kentish cadged a space in a company's cellar. During the afternoon I was sent up with Major Gell to reconnoitre the country in front of Villers-Faucon. Here, as we stood on the forward slope of the hill, we saw the cavalry forming up for an attack on the positions in front of Epernay. They had just got into column when the Boche spotted them and opened their artillery. This created a terrific panic, and they commenced wheeling and circling in an effort to writhe away from the zone of fire. There was great disorder, and many of the horses bolted, although there were practically no casualties. As we strolled along watching them, we saw our divisional general, Dickie Fanshawe, standing alone on a little knoll. He also was interested in the attack which started soon afterwards. It was a very pretty sight, and for a moment we were thrilled by the line of galloping horses and pointed swords in perfect order, but the excitement was soon spent, for we knew that there were no enemy in front. We saw 1 or 2 fellows whirl out of their saddles from long-range machine-gun fire, but then came a pitiful anticlimax, for on meeting with a few thin strands of wire, they were thrown into confusion, and as Fanny mounted and rode away, we started off too, leaving a line of dismounted troopers leading their frightened horses across the entanglement. As we continued our reconnaissance, Fanny came galloping back and handed a packet of chocolate to Gell, saying, "This may be useful to you." It is this benevolent habit that has earned him the nickname of the Chocolate Soldier. Having finished our deco, we returned to Longovesna, where I spent a most uncomfortable night, half standing, half sitting in my tiny billet. April 3rd. We had been very uneasy on account of a great swaying house-side which overhung our billet and some of the men's shelters. So I got my men together, and after working from 9 a.m. to noon, succeeded in bringing it down in a cloud of dust with no casualties. I also put in some good work on the town major. I said so much that to save himself more, he consented to hand over the harness room to us, and himself entered into my cubbyhole. Good luck to him. Billy and I gave him no time for a second opinion, but installed our valises and servants at once. Then we walked round the village, and found that last night a mine blew up at the crossroads, and killed the padre of the 10th Manchesters, who was in my old billet in the chicken run. It was raining hard when we returned to our billet. There we found the commanding officer talking to a tall, thin second lieutenant, with a fair moustache and washed-out eyes. He wore a tin hat tipped over his eyes and looked very tired. The commanding officer seemed relieved to see us, and murmuring, "Ah, Holland, this is Kentish, your company commander," he hurried away. The new arrival drew himself up and raised his hand in a long, slow stage salute, saying, "Sir, I am pleased and proud to have the honour of meeting you in the scene of operations, and I can assure you that I will do my best to serve you, and my king, at a top rate. I've crossed over to make good, and to help the old country all ends up." Billy was rather taken aback by this, and feebly replied, "Quite, that's the spirit." Then we took him into our billet and showed him our spirit. He was already very tight, having turned up with Major Townsend. This was an excellent fellow, late of our regiment but always tight so that he could not be kept in the battalion. It broke his heart to be sent back to England, so now he had been given the job of divisional salvage officer. Holland talked without pause from the moment he came in. He told us about his exploits as a commercial traveller in Birmingham and in Canada, and about his one brief visit to the trenches a year before, where he was slightly wounded in the shoulder 10 minutes after entering the line. He was a dreadful bore, but his curious terms of speech and intonations made me shout with laughter. After dinner, he said he would build us a real good blaze, as the evening was chilly. So out he went into the rain and secured some oil-soaked rafters, which he hacked into 2-foot lengths. He piled these up in a corner close by our feet and lit them. All through the night he continued to pile on fuel until the place was worse than an oven. The wall was red hot, and I had to roll up my valise to save it burning. Worst of all, as there was no chimney or window, the smoke had to filter out slowly through the oil-sheet-covered doorway. April 4th. I was driven out by the heat at early dawn. The others stuck it until 7 a.m. when Holland started talking. It had been raining hard, so there were plenty of puddles, and we got a good wash. We had not shaved for days, and presented a very ragged appearance. Moreover, I had developed a beastly rash over my body, which Holland said was Gordham's scabies. Kentish had the wind-up and said he would not sleep with me any more till I had seen the doctor. We learnt that the town major had spent the night walking about in the rain, as our fire had made his cubbyhole untenable. Holland was detailed for company orderly officer, but when we held a rifle inspection at 10 a.m. he was absent, and when he turned up at 1 p.m. he was very tight. He had been drinking again with Major Townsend. Billy gave him a choking off, whereupon he cried bitterly and promised never to do it again. Then he went off to the cookers to see the dinner issued. He returned later with a mug full of lukewarm, greasy, half-cooked stew, floating with cabbage leaf. Upon this he proceeded to eulogize. He said that when he got to the field kitchen, the pontoon was not cooked, so he had issued the jam pudding first. This, he assured us, was a downright treat, for he had sampled it before the whole company to show them how good it was. Next, he had drunk a mug of the half-cooked stew, to show them how good it was going to be. Then he had brought back a mug so that we might share his enjoyment. We declined it and persuaded him to pour it down his throat to stop him talking. At 2 p.m. we paraded as a working party and marched to Salcourt, followed by a limber bearing picks and shovels. We were to dig cruciform trenches on either side of the road junction to form a strong point in front of the village. First, we marked out the position by means of tapes, then we commenced to dig, I with 2 platoons on the right, Holland with the other 2 platoons on the left of the road. At the end of about an hour, apparently Jerry thought we had worked the Union time, for with a fearful clatter a salvo of 5.9 shells burst close by, followed at once by 2 or 3 more salvos, dead on us. Number 1 was hit, for we dived like rabbits into the sunken road or under whatever cover was handy. The guns stopped at once, and after a few minutes we returned to our digging. I climbed up on Holland's side and stood talking with him and Corporal Kirby for a few minutes until crash, crash. They came again right amongst us. As we ducked, I felt a hot blast behind me and went tumbling head over heels down the bank into the road. Kirby was a good second and sat up with a look of pained surprise. A piece of shell had ripped his leather jerkin from tail to collar, shaved a bare patch on the back of his head, and smashed his tin hat, but he was not scratched. Several more bursts came, and Billy, who had been lurking higher up the road, decided that it was impossible to carry on, and gave us the order to form up to march back. As we were stacking the tools in the limber, Holland's platoon sergeant said, "Excuse me, sir, aren't you hit?" and pointed to a tiny blood spot on his shoulder. "Blank me," said Holland, "I sure am." A tiny bit of shell had gone into his skin 1/2 inch from the last wound he got. He did not wait for a dressing, or sympathy, or even to say goodbye. He just shot off down the road, while we followed at a more leisurely pace. While marching back, we saw 4 of our kite balloons come down in flames. Arrived at Longavenna. Billy put in a casualty report, but Holland had not reported back. We wired all neighbouring dressing stations and battalions, but there was no trace of him. Finally, at 6 p.m, Billy said we must go and search. I wanted to let him rip, but Billy wouldn't. We shouldn't have let him go alone, he said. He may be throwing a fit in a field this minute. This picture left me cold, but out I had to go with a squad along one road, while Billy went up another, yelling and shouting exactly like our night search for 13 Platoon. Of course it rained, and at 10 p.m. we returned tired, hungry and drenched to the skin, to learn that Holland had hopped on a limber and gone straight down to Perone. We drank his damnation and good riddance in a hot whiskey. I tried to ring up the doctor about my rash, but could not get him, so I walked to Tincourt through the rain and darkness to find him. He was out, and his orderlies told me I had scabies and should go to hospital. However, I pushed on to the 10th Manchesters to see their doctor, but he was ill himself, and back I had to slog and turned in beside Billy despite his protests. April 5th. The doctor, an objectionable Irishman called Carroll, turned up during the morning. Told me that I had not got scabies, it was a rash caused by vermin and dirt. He also said that the commanding officer was going to choke me off for ringing him up at such an absurd hour. Later, Ewing, the young Scot from A Company, turned up and took over the company from Billy, who was going on leave. He seemed quite a nice fellow, but very quiet and nervous on taking over command. I had not met him much before. He told me we were to move tomorrow, April 6th, moved at midday up to Salcourt, where we sat the troops down in a large courtyard while we looked for billets. A and C Company HQs had a fine cellar in the farm, and we managed to squeeze our troops into the hayloft. For ourselves, we could find no shelter, so we decided to have our meals in with A and C, and laid our valises out in the corner of a cellar. The roof was blown away, so we just lay looking up at the sky. Fortunately, the rain had stopped. April 7th. The Boche had shelled fairly closely during the night, but no damage was done. I didn't even get the wind-up. I turned out very early, thoroughly enjoying the fresh air, though it was very cold. At 6 p.m. we were suddenly turned out and marched up to support an attack on Ephy. We simply lay out in the wet grass and saw or heard nothing of the attack, but a little machine gun and rifle fire in the distance.